Folks, to this week's Florida Talks at Home program. We are going to give everyone just a minute or two to migrate over from the lobby into the main program here. In the meantime, if you have never attended a Click Meeting program, you can correspond via the chat box in the bottom right-hand screen. You can also move our video feeds around on your screen by clicking and dragging if it's in an inconvenient spot. If you're having any audio or video issues seeing or hearing us, you can usually fix those by just logging out and logging back in. We'll get started in just a minute or so. All right, we will go ahead and get started with tonight's event. Welcome to this week's installment of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Alex Buell, the Public Programs Coordinator for Florida Humanities. Normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programming like this in person, but obviously that can't happen right now. Our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening people in person once again. Next week's event will be on July 29th at 6 p.m. and will feature Dr. Martha Beretta discussing Jim Crow in Florida. You can register for this event on our Facebook page or at floridahumanities.org. At the end of tonight's presentation, we have a very short survey. Before signing off, we'd greatly appreciate you taking a moment to fill it out. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat field in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and she'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Tonight, we welcome Mallory O'Connor, Professor Emeritus of Art History at Santa Fe College. She has organized numerous exhibits on Florida art and history, including Florida Before Columbus, Opening the Door to the New World, Mark Catesby in La Florida, The Great Alachua Savanna, A Visual History of Paynes Prairie, and The Art of Hope, the WPA art in Florida, and The Fountain of Youth in Florida History, Mythology, and Art. And with that, I will turn it over to Mallory O'Connor.
Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome to all of you folks that are joining us here. I'm glad to see you. The topic that I want to look at this evening, and the title of my talk is Strangers in a Strange Land, Picturing Florida Through Art. So what we're going to do is take a tour of Florida's history based on how artists have looked at it throughout the years. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind is what I think a lot of these images could be called is a sort of visual mythology. Now, what do I mean by that? Visual mythology. What do you think of when you think of somebody says, oh, that's a myth? A lot of us would immediately say, oh, that's not true. But that's not the original meaning of the word myth. Mythos, the Greek word for myth, actually means what the people believe. In other words, popular culture, what people think they're seeing, or what people believe is true. So visual mythology, and I think so many images of Florida, no matter how, quote, realistic people were trying to be, are really a kind of mythology of Florida. And it's that mythology, that very rich visual mythology, that I think gives art about Florida a distinctive quality. One of the consistent features of Florida's cultural evolution has been change. Wave after wave of visitors and immigrants have passed through this peninsula, and each new wave of people brought in the new ideas, they brought in new cultures. We're a real salad bar, of different people and places and so on. They brought their intimate personal view. And that's what various artists have brought us. They have brought their intimate personal view of Florida from their perspective. So that's what we're going to be dealing with. Salvador Dali is an interesting case in point. If any of you have been to the Salvador Dali Museum, you might have had a chance to see this Columbus discovering America in person. It was painted back in the 1958-59. And his version is filled with all sorts of symbols that depict not the reality of Columbus coming to the shores of America, but rather the psychological impact of the discovery and the symbolism of it. Columbus is shown not as a grown man, but rather as an adolescent boy right here, and full of youthful enthusiasm. Dali's wife, Gaia, is portrayed as the Virgin Mary on a banner that Columbus carries, representing the introduction of Christianity into the New World, along with the monks down at the bottom carrying the symbol of the cross. So we have his image of coming to America, bringing European concepts, bringing Christian civilization to the shores of America. But who discovered Florida? Spoiler alert, it wasn't really Columbus. It wasn't Ponce de Leon. Sorry about that. It was people who came here a long, long time before that. Throughout history, Florida has been a frontier, a port of entry between the old world and the new. And that's not just Europe, that's other places as well. And while most of America has been systematically settled with a familiar landscape, Florida has continued to be a sort of work in progress, an ongoing experiment in political, cultural, and environmental evolution. So to begin our portrait of Florida, we need to go back to the first encounter between people and this land. Thousands of years before the Europeans arrived on the Florida Peninsula, another group of people moved in, around 12,000 BC, quite a while before the Europeans began to arrive. And these early immigrants are known as the Paleo-Indians. Florida was much drier and cooler when these people arrived. It was a semi-barren wilderness of grassy savannas and scrub vegetation. So it didn't look much at all like it does today. It had a variety of now extinct species of animals and wildlife, mammoths, mastodons, what they call, paleo flora and fauna. And what amazes me is that these early people were able to hunt these incredibly large animals using a piece of chipped stone on the end of a stick. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a museum of natural history and seen the skeleton of a mammoth or a mastodon, but they are really big. And I don't think I want to go after one of those guys with a piece of stone on the end of a stick. Kind of puts things in perspective. Settlement in Florida was pretty sporadic until the warming of the oceans and the rise of the sea levels produced a more hospitable environment. Around 5000 BC, Florida became a much more suitable place for people to maybe inhabit and thrive. So early settlers formed a variety of distinctive cultures, and we trace them based on pottery types and tools and weapons that they made. Most of the early people, even those who built impressive mounds and semi-permanent structures, yes, we have had a number of those in Florida, were hunters and gatherers. It wasn't until later that a few began to practice agriculture. So in contrast to some of the other areas of the Southeast, Florida was not a big agricultural enterprise in terms of what the Native Americans did. By the 1st century BC, the Tequesta, an early variant, eastern variant of the Glades Indian culture, had established themselves in the area that would one day become Miami. Other early Floridians, the ancestors of the Timucua, the Apalachee, and the Calusa, settled along the coast and along the inland waterways throughout the state, which they used as a kind of interstate highway system. With their dugout canoes, it allowed them to trade from one place to another, to travel from one place to another. One of the places where a very distinctive settlement can be found is at the Fort Walton site, the Buck Mound site at Fort Walton Beach, Florida, up in the Panhandle area. This culture is called the Weeden Island people, and they thrived around 800 AD, up until shortly before the time the Europeans arrived. The type site, what we call the type site in archaeology, is the place where this type of culture was first found, and the type site is Weeden Island, which is actually in the Tampa Bay area. But we find evidence of this same culture traced through their distinctive pottery and their other distinctive aspects of their culture throughout the state. Here is a beautiful example of early Florida Indian art, a human effigy urn from the Buck Mound site at Fort Walton Beach, dating from about 800 AD. It's what we call polychrome or multicolored ceramics. It's about 18 inches high, just to give you an idea of the scale here. What does it represent? Well, that's a very good question. We can see that it's a character, a figure. The figure is wearing a mask. They found this kind of masks associated with Weeden Island culture. It's wearing a cape that's bands of red and white and black. He's seated on a stool, nice little wooden stool. We found examples of that within Weeden Island areas. And the artist has used a combination of modeling and coiling and slab construction to create this exotic sculpture. We don't really know who this is supposed to represent, whether it's a god or a chief or some prominent member of the community. We have found images of human figures wearing feathered capes that are associated with many of the important figures in the ceremonial life of the pre-Columbian Indians of the Southeast. A bird man, or sometimes called the falcon impersonator. Now, whether the Buck Mound urn is meant to represent a deity or a powerful human shaman, the sculpture gives us a glimpse of the inner life of Florida's indigenous people. Another group in the Key Marco area from just about the same time is the Calusa culture. These southwestern Floridians were enchanted with some of the things that we find so wonderful in Florida today. For example, dolphins. And here they have two playing, leaping dolphins that have been engraved in a piece of turtle shell. What they would do would be to use some sort of sharp instrument and engrave the lines into the shell of the turtle, and then to take some dark pigment of some sort and rub it on the surface and then wipe it clean, and the dark pigment adheres inside the lines, so it almost looks like an ink line. But this is a Calusa shell image of dolphins. How Floridian, right? The Timucuans were another group of people who were simultaneously around the same time, 600, 800 AD, that were in Florida. And that is a culture that is found in North Florida, North Central Florida. The Timucuan people also worked in ceramics. They were more naturalistic in their depictions of human figures, however. So here is a Timucuan human figure. It has a characteristic headdress or hairstyle that we see in a lot of Timucuan imagery, kind of a prototype for the man bun, I guess. The Europeans' interaction with the native peoples was horrific, to say the least, although it started out better than it ended up. When Jacques Lemoyne, or when René de Laudonnière, the French Huguenot explorer, arrived in Florida in the 1560s, he made contact with the local Indians, and here we see a column that was erected. I think there is still, I'm not sure, is it a replica perhaps, of this column over on the St. Johns River near Jacksonville on the south side of the river. And this depiction by the artist who came along with René de Laudonnière, Jacques Lemoyne, he depicts René standing here with the chief of the local Indians, the Chief Athor, at a column which he believed had been erected to celebrate the arrival of the Europeans. And the Indians are all here as supplicants, bringing offerings of food and other gifts to celebrate the arrival of the Europeans. Well, they weren't going to be celebrating too much longer as they began succumbing to smallpox and other European diseases, and their communities ravaged and so on. So as I said, this didn't turn out exactly well for the indigenous population. One of the things that the Spanish brought with them was, of course, the Christian religion, and they built a series of missions throughout Florida, although none of them really survive in the same way that they did in some other parts of the country. I grew up in California. So when someone said Spanish missions, boy, I knew San Juan Bautista, Santa Barbara, all of the beautiful big adobe missions that were still standing out there. And I had visited a lot of them. So when I came to Florida, I said, well, where are the missions? I ought to be able to go and see some of them. But unfortunately, most of them were built with wood. That was the local building material. And therefore, in this hot and humid climate in Florida, most of them did not survive as those on the West Coast had. This is what one of the artists working in the 1800s thought was the ruins of an old Spanish mission. And that's what he titled this piece of the stonework and so on that he assumed was part of an old Spanish mission. But he missed the bet here. It was actually the ruins of a sugar mill. It was later identified by archaeologists as being mistitled as a Florida mission. The Spanish did bring gifts, though. They didn't just bring bad things. And the myth of Arcadia, the promised land of milk and honey, was a potent idea, along with the idea of El Dorado, where the streets were made of gold. So, was there gold to be found in Florida? The Spanish hoped so, and they certainly went looking for it. And Jacques Lemoyne, who I mentioned, one of the early artists to visit Florida, even made an engraving of what he said were Indians bringing gold from the St. Johns River. Well, the Spanish had high hopes for that, but unfortunately, there didn't seem to be very much gold in Florida. What they did find, though, was that it was an agricultural Eden. And so two things that they brought that really caught the imagination of Florida and also was a perfect place to do these things in Florida was citrus and cattle. Here is a citrus label, chest of gold. So what was the gold in Florida? Oranges. A former art critic for the Miami Herald, Helen Cohen, points out that of all blooms celebrated in Florida, the state named for flowers, none has more to define it, build it, and sell it than the orange blossom. The orange is Florida, and it made Florida, providing an authentic fountain of youth with its vitamins, supplying the legendary gold that the state's early explorers lusted after. The first advertised land sales in Florida were for orange groves. And the vocabulary, the quasi-religious vocabulary consistent with the offerings of paradise, often referred to oranges. Well, we know today that there's more than 170,000 acres of citrus grown in Florida. And despite problems like major freezes and more recently citrus greening, Florida is still a major crop, and it was one that the Spanish are responsible for bringing to the area. Something else that they brought? Cattle. Cities grew up along the St. Johns River. The Spanish created ranches that they located all along, especially along the St. Johns River. And they brought horses and cattle to the region, and it turned out to be very good for raising cattle. Kate Barnes, over here, Cracker Cabin at Cross Creek, was born and raised in the Midwest. She was educated at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and completed her formal training in Japan. But after she moved to Florida, she took up residence at Cross Creek and became thoroughly imbued in terms of Florida culture and history. And in the early 1980s, Cross Creek, Orange Lake, and Lake Lochaloosa were threatened by a proposal for a massive housing development encompassing these communities. And a group of residents from the Friends of Cross Creek, a grassroots environmental group led by Kate Barnes, eventually was successful in preserving their historic community and the conservation of 50 square miles of the real Florida. Kate is a great admirer of the cracker tradition, and there's, of course, lots of different theories about how the idea, the term cracker, came to be, the most popular of which is that it had to do with the cattle drivers and their whips, which they cracked in order to move the herds from one place to another. So there's lots of different possibilities for how that came about, but her depiction here, a watercolor of a cracker cabin. She studied local history and architecture extensively and has had a lot of interesting paintings that were based on what she found out about Florida's cracker history. Here's Frederick Remington's picture of a fight over a stolen herd. So Remington, an illustrator for magazines as well as a painter, picks up on some of the sort of local problems and issues that he illustrates here. When the Spanish ceded Florida to the British in exchange for Havana in 1763, many Spaniards left for Cuba, and their departure left a population vacuum in the region that was soon filled by an influx of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama. Now, most of the original indigenous population was either killed off or moved out. The last Timucuan Indians accompanied the Spanish to Cuba, and so there really weren't very many of the original Indians that were left in Florida. But the Creeks from Alabama and from Georgia were being pushed southward by settlers in the area, and Florida was still a wide open territory, and so they moved in. And these newcomers encouraged the agriculture of the area. They took over the abandoned fields, they took over the herds of cattle and horses, and they found North Florida well suited to their needs. The Spanish officials were happy to have the Creeks, as they became known, in the area as a buffer against the growing British threat in the Carolinas and Georgia. And over the next few decades, the Florida Creeks began to modify their culture, and they became what's now known as the Seminole Indians. So this is a painting by a Florida artist, Theodore Morris, who has made his life's work to try to depict the Seminoles. And here he shows a Seminole warrior dressed in the traditional Seminole shirt. He studied things like headdresses, hairstyles, jewelry, other kinds, insignia, other kinds of things that had to do with Seminole culture. He tries to be very exacting. He works with archaeologists. He put together a wonderful book of Florida, illustrating Florida Indians. So Theodore Morris, you ought to be aware of his important work in terms of Florida Indians. Another Florida artist who has dealt with Florida Indians and Florida history in general is Jackson Walker, a very talented artist of historical subjects. And here is his depiction of the capture of Osceola, who was captured under a white flag of truce. It was a trick, and he was taken to the fort in at St. Augustine, and then was held there, eventually dying in captivity. So Jackson Walker's capture of Osceola is another historic work. If you go to DeLand, the courthouse there has a number of Jackson Walker's paintings illustrating events from Florida history. Well, what about the very earliest European artists who happened to come to Florida? What did they see? The Spanish had opened the door to the New World, but the French and the English quickly established their own presence, and Florida would become a frontier for an ever-expanding flood of people from different places that would diversify the region's culture and lead to 5 centuries of amazing growth and development. Artist naturalists were at the forefront of the peaceful invaders who came and wanted to see what was there. There was a huge demand on the part of the European populace for images of the New World. They wanted to know who and what was here, what did it look like, what were the animals, what was the flora and fauna like, and early explorers and artists were happy to try to give them some idea, although sometimes it was based on some rather specious possibilities. An example, André Thevet was a naturalist artist. He was illustrating images from the New World, although he hadn't actually been to Florida. He had been to South America, and he thought, well, it's got to be something like that. And he also used hearsay and what people told him about what they'd seen as a point of departure for his work. So this is called Mythical Beast of the St. John's. Whoa, I wouldn't want to come across one of those. The Gorgon's sort of devil head, cloven hooves, this great plume of a tail. But what do we find here? We see the beast's babies being carried on its back. What do you think this beast represents, really? Is this a mythical, magical beast? Or could it be someone's description of a, ta-da, opossum? Europeans had never seen marsupials. They didn't know what to make of them. And so when they had something like this described to them, they thought it was some kind of really strange, magical beast. One of the more scientifically trained artist naturalists to first come to Florida was Mark Catesby. And here we have a book that was written about the curious Mr. Catesby, who was indeed curious. He wanted to know everything he could find out about the flora and fauna. He was a member of the British Royal Society, which was founded in 1660, so that knowledge should be tested by making observations in the field. That was their scientific method. And so by the 3rd decade of the 1700s, London had become the self-proclaimed center of the new science, a science based on observation and rational inquiry. And members of the Royal Society were not willing to publicly acknowledge their debt to colonial naturalists, who were the key to the development of European natural history, but they were not shy about requesting specimens and other things from the colonials. One of the artists that came over, an English artist who came over to make a detailed observation of the flora and fauna in this area, was Mark Catesby. He arrived in America in 1722 on assignment from English patrons to collect plants and animal specimens and to visually document the native flora and fauna of the southern colonies. He had a sister who had married a military man who was stationed in Virginia. So he used that as his kind of base while he was traveling around the Southeast. Now, we're not sure they actually ever got into Florida. We know he got as far as probably St. Mary's, maybe Jacksonville area. He also went on from there to the Bahamas, and his major work is The Natural History of the Carolinas, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which was published before the American Revolution, one of the most comprehensive illustrated documentaries of the plants and animals of the New World. Probably better known than Catesby is William Bartram. And because of his florid style and his boundless enthusiasm, the Philadelphia artist naturalist Bartram has frequently been portrayed as a sort of sensitive, romantic, free spirit wandering all over the Southeast, a kind of flower child, you might say. But his sensitivity to the beauty of nature and his powerful emotions don't really translate into a lack of courage or physical weakness or scientific inquiry, because he was very good about all of that. He first came to Florida in 1765 with his father, who was, of all things, the botanist to King George, the royal botanist. He held a royal appointment and was from Philadelphia. He had a farm there. He grew crops. He specialized in native seeds. So the people in England were very interested in his work. When he came down, he brought his son along with him. And so William fell in love with Florida. He didn't want to go back. As soon as he could, he came back and bought a piece of property on the St. Johns River. Well, that turned out to be a bust. So he went back to Philadelphia sort of with his tail between his legs. But in 1775, he was commissioned by, again, English patrons, this is before the Revolution, to come down to the Southeast and to make a really comprehensive study of the area. And what resulted from this was his book called Travels, which documents his travels throughout the Southeast. It's an absolutely amazing document. If you haven't read it, read it. Now, the only place where you might get a little bit carried away, or he gets a little carried away, is, I can go through like 5 pages of his descriptions of trees. And finally I say, Billy, could you get off the subject of the hemlock for a little while anyway? But other parts of his narrative are very lively, like his discussion of alligators. He was fascinated with them and terrified by them, of course. But his documentation of a fight between alligators is amazing and colorful, to say the least. Here's another of his illustrations. And as you can see, Bartram frequently put a number of different species into one particular piece. Here he has a lotus pod, a snail shell, and a blackroot, all put in together. He liked to think about nature as an ecology. So he's kind of an early environmentalist. When you look at his father's work, these are like specimens pinned to a board, one at a time. When you look at William's work, it's this wonderful kind of choreography of nature, of things coming together, all kinds of different animals and plants that he wants to portray interacting with each other. Audubon, the third artist naturalist to come to Florida and to make a name for himself as an illustrator of Florida's wonders, John James Audubon. And he proved to be a kind of a failure as a businessman, but distinguished himself as an artist and as a scientist and as a traveler. In 1831, he traveled to Florida, promising to go further down the peninsula than any of his predecessors. And because he had won a coveted membership in London's Royal Society, he was able to obtain U.S. permission to travel on a government cutter, the Spark, which regularly patrolled Florida's wilderness. He wasn't happy. He didn't like Florida. He wrote to his wife, "I have been deceived most shamefully about the Floridas. My account of what I shall see in Florida will be very far from corroborating the flowery sayings of Mr. Barton." In his journal, he wrote, "The River St. John's does not seem to me to be equal in beauty to the fair Ohio. The shores in many places are low and swampy. Fully 100 miles from the mouth of the river, the fog is so thick that neither the shores could be seen, and yet the river was not a mile in breadth. The mosquitoes covered every object, even the cabins. So wonderfully abundant were these tormentors that they more than once extinguished the candles whilst I was trying to write my journal." So Audubon was not a big fan, but he did some wonderful illustrations of what he found here: flamingos and the Carolina parrot, the parakeet, which now is extinct, and many other creatures. Florida has always been a land of dreams, a kind of landscape of the imagination, or what I like to call a Florida of the mind. pictured by artists not as it actually was, but as it might be, or as they thought it should be, or as it could be. Here's a Florida landscape by Christian Eisel, who was here in the after the Civil War. And following the Civil War, many European or Americans and Europeans came to Florida trying to get a handle on what was here. They hadn't been able during the Civil War years to come down here. And so once they had an opportunity, they flooded into the area and began to see what it was that would capture their imagination. Christian Eisel was a landscape painter in the tradition of the Hudson River School. Here's his view of the St. John's from 1875. Martin Johnson Head, a little bit later, came down. Head was another northern artist. Here's his Florida Marsh from 1887. He came down at the behest of Flagler. Mr. Flagler had established himself in St. Augustine. He wanted to start an art colony there. He hoped to attract northern artists to come down and live in St. Augustine, paint pictures, and then draw the tourists there to buy their pictures and stay at his hotel. A lot of them are very romantic. Here's George Loring Brown's Okefenokee Swamp by Moonlight. This is 1866. It was like theater sets. Well, the landscape was romantic and unusual and different in terms of what Northerners found there. In more contemporary times, we have Gainesville artist Peter Carolyn's Paynes Prairie Palms, still capturing the kind of wonderful exuberance of the Florida landscape. Peter tends to paint big. I think this is about maybe 5 by 8 or 9 feet, a great big canvas that tries to capture that huge sky. Peter's fascinated with clouds. Ansel Adams once said, Florida doesn't have mountains, but by golly, Florida's got clouds. So here are these wonderful piled up clouds that kind of take the place of mountains. Another phenomena from Florida in terms of the landscape was the highwaymen. Beanie Bacchus was a landscape painter from South Florida, and he attracted to his studio a number of Black artists who were eager to learn how to paint, to get to have him share his techniques, which he did. And he acted as a mentor to many of these artists, and collectively they became known as the Florida Highwaymen. Why? Because they painted their beautiful pictures of Florida, and they parked along the edge of the tourist routes, and they literally sold their paintings out of the trunk of their car. And some of them became fairly famous, and today they're big collector's items. One of the things about the highwayman paintings, though, is even though they, when you say, okay, what has to be in a Florida painting? What are the things that say Florida to us? How about sunlight? How about palm trees? How about water birds? So the formula became, you have to have water, you have to have palm trees, you have to have water birds, and you have to have sunlight. And then that's a Florida painting. And if it's lacking those, well, probably it's not Florida then. It's just, that's, again, this visual mythology that I was talking about. Margaret Tolbert is another contemporary artist who deals with the Florida landscape. And the springs became Florida springs became very popular in the 1800s because people started coming down to take the waters. They supposedly had marvelous curative powers and became a real tourist draw. And Margaret, as a contemporary artist, is also a diver and a scuba diver. And so she paints in a way that looks at first glance to be abstract, maybe abstract expressionist, big, broad brushstrokes on large canvases. But if you look closely, you'll see there's a line of trees up here. And Margaret goes down into the water and looks up at the landscape, looks up through these shafts of colored light that she sees from down below. And so this is really a pretty realistic painting. If you go down into the springs and you look up at the light shining through the layers and the reflecting off limestone and so on. This is what you're liable to see in a realistic way. I think I will kind of move on here rather quickly to the idea of diversity. I mentioned a sense of place and the fact that Florida is full of all kinds of different cultures and people who came from all over the place. Here is Mitch Colby's painting of oyster shuckers in Apalachicola. One kind of localized phenomena, but a very much a part of Florida. Here's Mike Siegel's painting of Pelican Cove in Cedar Key, a sort of whimsical, almost folk art view of this. A parade of diversities have come through here. Here's Frank Shapley's painting of the slave market, something we might not want to really remember, but that was absolutely a part of our Florida heritage that we can't ignore, no matter how much we'd like to. Winslow Homer gives us a rather pastoral view of this called Picking Cotton. And then we have a wonderful body of work that's actually done by a variety of different African-American or Black artists who work in the state. Here is Purvis Young's painting called Reaching Up for a Better Life. And Purvis Young deals with the Black experience in Florida. He deals with a kind of also a sort of universal symbolism for issues in the Black community. And so here's his painting that he titled, he was born in Miami's Liberty City in 1943, became an artist of the street without really any formal training, and kind of took on as his mission a documentation of Black culture and Black problems. He's become very popular, has had several museum shows, has been purchased by several museums. He's a real success story in terms of bringing his view, his very personal view of Florida to the attention of other people. And another similar artist, Joey Smolin. Here are Black People Get Hungry Too. Another social justice kind of painting done in 1997 in acrylic mounted on canvas board. And it's in the collection of the Polk Museum of Arts in Lakeland. His crude but colorful paintings documented his life in Lakeland, Florida, where he settled. And this is a painting that he did, as I said, in 1997. Sometimes people forget that we have a number of Asian cultures here in Florida, that the Japanese had a large colony down in South Florida. And here is if you forget about that, you can visit the Murakami Museum of Asian Art and Architecture, the Murakami Museum, which is a wonderful collection. And it's really, gives you a great idea of the Japanese presence in architecture, art, and artifacts. Gary Monroe, a photographer and writer, is done a wonderful series on Jewish life in the South Beach area. A lot of these wonderful black and white photographs that he did, hundreds of the kind of behind the scenes images of Jewish life in South Florida. And they show a number of different issues, again, social justice issues, the people in these neighborhoods taking advantage of the climate, the therapeutic ocean, facing the adversity of old age, and the community fabric, this kind of tight bond. And then on the right here, Mitch Colby's Greek Easter, because, we have a very large Greek population in Florida. And on the West Coast near Tarpon Springs, they follow a number of different traditional Greek festivals and ways of doing things. And then, of course, we cannot overlook the Cuban influence in Florida. Here are two wonderful painters and sculptors in Florida, Gilberto Ruiz, and he does this very fanciful kind of surreal image of this man flying above this pond. It's called The Encounter. And I think he was thinking of the comet that when Halley's Comet made an appearance in Florida, and he documented this sort of mystical experience. Susana Sari also is a Cuban immigrant brought when she was a child from Cuba. And here is her image of a sculptured face. This is a mixed media piece called Infinite Being. I just wanted to show you a couple of pieces, examples. I know we're getting on short time here, but the sort of tourist art that's been produced for Florida, it's been very popular. The steamboats on the Ocklawaha that we see in this painting here. The Fountain of Youth. I'm not going to get into the whole Fountain of Youth mythology, but here he is, Ponce de Leon, with his wonderful Fountain of Youth, toasting us and Florida for what he did or didn't find here. Florida, of course, the Fountain of Youth, a huge major myth in the Florida mindset. Here's Thomas Moran's Ponce de Leon in Florida, and a St. Augustine postcard showing the magical Fountain of Youth, which had so many places. And then in popular culture, the continuation of this idea of Florida, the Mermaids of Weeki Wachee, a movie poster, Pirates of the Caribbean. And of course, we have to look at the Magic Kingdom. Here's Mitch Colby's portrait of the Ott family in front of Cinderella's castle at the Magic Kingdom. And the title is, Are We There Yet? A family portrait done in, I think about, when was this done? Around 2000, something like that. But he concentrates, as he did in the Greek Easter, on aspects of Florida in the popular imagination. And finally, we have Sidney McKenna's kind of dramatic study of a Florida sunset called Rapture in the Postmodern Age from 2010, an oil on canvas. Ultimately, as you, I hope, have kind of gotten the idea that Florida does have it all. The sort of best and the worst of everything, beaches and palms, flamingos and oranges, rosy sunsets, but also rattlesnakes and gangsters and mosquitoes and heedless development. So art provides this sort of visual homilies, little sermons about daily survival, social interaction, and the look and feel of our landscape. David Sawyer, in a series, says this: long vistas to brilliant sunsets, boats on dark rivers, and men dominated by nature can be intended as subtle allegories for the span of a life, rites of passage, or the struggle and joy of all that surrounds us. Each artist, each image has a story to tell, a gift to share. Art can play a special role by showing us who we are and what we are, by showing us the past, enriching the present, and imagining the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory. With that, we will open it up to Q&A. And if you don't have any questions before you log off, we'd really appreciate you taking a minute and filling out our survey that we just put up. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and Mallory and I will hang out for as long as needed to answer them.
Okay, I'm seeing some questions coming up on the chat box here. So then, who were the indigenous Indians? Who were the indigenous Indians? There were a number of different Indians that divided into various groups depending on when they came and where they settled. So we do have the Calusa in South Florida. We have the Glades cultures. We have the Timucuans in the central part of the state. We have the Weeden Island people. it wasn't one indigenous group. There were many. And we're not even sure where all of them came from. Traditionally, the idea that anthropologists and archaeologists have instituted is that they came over the Bering Straits and that they infiltrated then into South America, into Central America, into the east part of the North American continent. There's a lot of scholars who are questioning that. There's just too much evidence that there were not one, but multiple entry points for the indigenous people. So that's kind of an open question and always an interesting one. Okay, let's see. Are these artworks at locations all over Florida? Good question. Yes, a number of these images have been purchased by Florida museums. Others are in art galleries. There was at one time the idea of creating a museum of Florida art, which is a wonderful idea, and I wish somebody would resurrect that idea. The DeLand Museum kind of played around with that idea for a while and decided not to go forward with it, but I think it's a wonderful idea because obviously there is just so much from Florida that really is important and that needs to be preserved. What was the major type of art that was used for advertising during the Florida land boom of the 1920s? Good one. One of the things that became very popular in terms of Florida's mythology was the connection with both Spain and with Moorish culture and with a kind of Aladdin's lamp, a sort of idea of recreating a sort of Moorish fantasia in Florida. So if you look at some of the 20s subdivisions, they have these incredible sort of Oriental inspired gates. And by that, I mean really Moorish. No, I don't mean Chinese, but I mean things that were inspired by the idea of, a sort of a Spanish, but even more Far Eastern, East Asia, Middle Eastern kind of concept. Excuse me, I'm all over the map there, but the idea that there was a similarity between Florida and some mythical land, and the developers really played with that. The Brown Museum of Florida Art and Museum of Arts and Sciences at Daytona is fabulous, absolutely. And the Brown collection at the Daytona Museum is wonderful. And they built a special museum area for the Brown collection, which documents a number of important pieces of Florida art. So there is, this interest in Florida art. And of course, the Brown collection represents one sort of collector's view, and their particular interests are evidenced in the collection. What I'd really like to see is a whole spectrum all the way across Florida's incredible history in one location. That would be fantastic. Any other questions? Alex, do you see any?
Not that I see. There are a few people typing, though. We'll give them a second to their thoughts. There's still some people typing, but for those of you who are still hanging out, we appreciate you coming and hope to see you next week for our talk on Jim Crow in Florida.
Okay, and thank you very much to everybody. Hope you're doing well. And do fill out a program survey if you can, because I always like to get feedback on it, what people think of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the last few comments were just that, comments, no questions. So I guess we'll go ahead and call it a night. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mallory, for doing this. And have a great rest of your evening, everybody. Good night.